Good evening. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. And a special welcome to those who are joining us on our YouTube channel and on C-SPAN. In just a few moments, a distinguished panel of historians will discuss the espionage case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were executed in 1953 after being convicted of spying for the Soviet Union. The panel will explore the Rosenberg case in all its complexity and emphasize different aspects of how Julius Rosenberg's spy network worked and what it actually did to aid the Soviets. The National Archives also holds many records related to the Rosenbergs. For example, our New York Archives holds formerly secret grand jury testimony transcripts and the Jello box used as evidence at their trial. Telegrams from Ethel Rosenberg and Julius Rosenberg's mother to President Eisenhower are housed at the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. We also have the Venona files, the once secret translations of decrypted Soviet diplomatic and intelligence messages intercepted during and after World War II. But before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to tell you about two upcoming programs taking place here in this theater. On Thursday, February 12th at 7, join us for Jazz at the National Archives with the Airmen of Note, the premier jazz ensemble of the United States Air Force. Created in 1950 to continue the tradition of Major Glenn Miller's Army Air Corps Dance Band, the band consists of active duty airmen musicians. The next day, February 13th at noon, legal scholar Leah Vandervelde will discuss her book, Redemption Songs, Suing for Freedom Before Dred Scott, and a book signing will follow that program. If you want to know more about these and all of our programs and exhibitions, please refer to our monthly calendar of events. There are copies in the lobby as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive it in the physical mail or by email. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications also in the lobby. And a little secret, no one has ever been turned down for membership in the foundation. Now it's my pleasure to turn the program over to our moderator for this evening's discussion. Marvin Kalb is a James Clark Welling Presidential Fellow at George Washington University and Edward R. Murrow Professor Emeritus at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's also a contributing news analyst for National Public Radio and Fox News Channel. A graduate of the City College of New York, Kalb has a master's degree from Harvard and was zeroing in on his doctorate in Russian history when he left Cambridge in 1956 for a Moscow assignment with the State Department. The following year, he joined CBS News, being the last correspondent hired by the legendary Edward R. Murrow. Kalb had a distinguished 30-year broadcast career working for both CBS News and NBC News, where he served as chief diplomatic correspondent, Moscow bureau chief, and moderator of Meet the Press. Among his many honors are 2 Peabody Awards, the DuPont Prize from Columbia University, the 206th Fourth Estate Award from the National Press Club, and more than half a dozen Overseas Press Club awards. Please join me in welcoming Marvin Kalb in tonight's panel.
Oh, my. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'll start and get us going. I'm Marvin Kalb, Senior Advisor at the Pulitzer Center, a Harvard Professor Emeritus, I'm happy to add, and I was once a journalist for CBS and NBC. And our program tonight focuses on the Rosenbergs and the role that they played in Soviet espionage in the United States during the Cold War. It's a heck of a story to start with, and I'm sure that you are all here because you are involved in it, whether emotionally or just intellectually. But it's a story that goes back to the times in the 1930s when young people joined the Communist Party in the United States, and then World War II came along, and the United States and the Soviet Union were allies against Hitler. And a number of people sort of carried on emotionally an attachment to the Soviet Union. And in this particular case, we're talking about people who were accused on the basis of very solid evidence of providing information in the making of atomic weapons from the United States to the Soviet Union, and they were Americans who were doing what they thought was right. And it started in early 1950 when one of the most important Soviet spies, who was the physicist Klaus Fuchs, was arrested, and FBI officials learned that Fuchs had passed information to Moscow via a courier named Harry Gold, and under interrogation, Gold identified David Greenglass as his contact, and Greenglass, in turn, identified Julius Rosenberg as the leader of a key spy ring. And in June of 1950, Julius and his wife Ethel were arrested, both of them charged with conspiracy to commit espionage under the Espionage Act of 1917. In March of 1951, they were convicted, and in June of 1953, they were executed. Since that time, there has been new information produced. We're going to be talking about some of that new information this evening. And what I would like to do now, and very quickly, is get into the introduction of the people who know a great deal more about this than I, and who will be sharing some of their wisdom with us. The number two over here is Harvey Klehr, who's the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Politics and History at Emory University. He's co-written many books dealing with American communism and Soviet espionage in the United States, including books co-authored with John Earl Haynes, sitting to my right, notably Spies, The Rise and Fall of the KGB in America, and Venona, Decoding Soviet Espionage in America. Mr. Haynes was for many years the 20th century political historian in the manuscript division of the Library of Congress. He retired in 2012, but he continues to work on this same subject. Ronald Radosh is the Professor of History Emeritus at the City University of New York, Senior Adjunct Fellow at the Hudson Institute. He's written widely about the Rosenberg case, including the book he co-authored with Joyce Milton called The Rosenberg File. Stephen Usdin is the Senior Washington Editor for BioCentury.com. He is also the author of Engineering Communism, How Two Americans Spied for Stalin and Founded the Soviet Silicon Valley. He's also published several major articles on the Rosenberg case. Allen Hornblum is a writer and former criminal justice official. He's the author of The Invisible Harry Gold, the man who gave the Soviets the atom bomb. And at the far end, to my right, my colleague Mark Kramer. He's director of Cold War Studies at Harvard and a senior fellow of Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. I'd like to start, if you gentlemen don't mind, with the historiography of the Rosenberg case and ask Professor Klehr to talk to us first, please.
Okay, well, John Haynes is, we've co-authored so many books that we can't remember who writes what. And John is going to offer a brief précis of the historiography of the case. I thought I would take just a minute, and literally a minute, and mention something that I don't think is going to be addressed directly by any of my colleagues up here. I'm fascinated by what the Rosenberg case illustrates about the tragedy of the Jewish relationship to communism. The Rosenbergs and their defenders for many years presented themselves as ordinary American Jews committed to anti-fascism who had been swept up in hysteria. And that's a trope that is, I think, deeply deceiving. Julius first began to try to approach Soviet intelligence officers in 1940 when the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were allies. And he continued his contacts with Soviet intelligence until 1950, well past the period in which really vicious anti-Semitic purges and pogroms were underway in both the Soviet Union and the East European satellite states. So, one of the interesting psychological questions, it seems to me, and I think it is a tragedy, is why Jews like the Rosenbergs were so committed to a regime that was second only to Adolf Hitler in the number of Jews it killed.
John, why don't you pick up the historiography at this point?
All right. The Rosenberg case generated enormous public attention in the early 1950s, and not surprisingly, there were in subsequent years hundreds of journalistic articles and commentaries about the case. Among these were a number of book-length accounts aimed at the general public. They varied in quality from Jonathan Root's solid 1963 book entitled The Betrayers, The Rosenberg Case, to the more polemical 1965 book, Invitation to an Inquest, by Walter and Marion Schneer. Root reviewed the trial transcript, newspaper articles, and other secondary sources, and concluded there was no reasonable doubt of the Rosenberg's guilt. In contrast, the Schneers, using much the same material, argued that the Rosenbergs never participated in espionage. Key items of evidence were government forgeries, and the confessions of David Greenglass and Harry Gold were false. The Schneers book set the talking points for the Rosenbergs were innocent side for decades. Frankly, these clashing accounts are about normal for a controversial, high-profile case. Think of the even more enormous amount of contradictory journalistic and polemical accounts of the Kennedy assassination. And there continues to this day an impressive volume of popular articles, books, TV documentaries, YouTube presentations on the Rosenberg case, many skewed to the Rosenbergs were innocent side. Now, 30 years or so after such an event, like the Rosenberg case, once primary materials start becoming available, one would have expected scholarly accounts of the case to come out. Starting in the 1980s, one would have expected eager young graduate students to have produced dozens of dissertations, later to be transformed into books, re-examining with new primary sources the substance of the case. One would have expected studies not only in the overall case, but also focusing on the roles and biographies of Rosenberg, Greenglass, Gold, and other members of Rosenberg's espionage apparatus. Or, if the Schneers were right, one would have expected scholarly accounts using archival documents to expose in detail the government's faked evidence and which officials directed the conspiracy to convict two innocent people. But this did not happen, and this is what is abnormal about scholarly coverage of the case. Today, more than 60 years after the case, enough time for two generations of scholars to have reviewed the evidence and brought in new material, there is only a single scholarly level comprehensive examination of the Rosenberg case, Radosh and Milton's 1983, the Rosenberg File. Despite a decade of service as a Soviet spy, there is only a single scholarly book on Harry Gold, Allen Hornblum's aptly named The Invisible Harry Gold. Morton Sobel, who was tried and convicted with the Rosenbergs, has yet to get a serious biography. David Greenglass has drawn only a single serious biography, The Brother, by Sam Roberts. As for the other half-dozen members of the Rosenberg ring, none have drawn serious scholarly attention except for two who secretly defected to the Soviet Union, Joel Barr and Alfred Sarant, who are the subject of Steve Usdin's impressive Engineering Communism. There are academic articles, dissertations, and books on peripheral aspects of the Rosenberg case, studies focusing on cultural tropes, media coverage, and the public political framing of the case. But these peripheral studies largely avoid original research on the actual core of the case. Did Julius Rosenberg participate in Soviet espionage? What did Gold, Sobel, Greenglass, and other members of the Rosenberg apparatus actually do? Often these accounts, these academic accounts, take a position of agnosticism, a position of not asserting the Rosenberg's innocence, but studiously avoiding acknowledge that the overwhelming weight of evidence establishes that Julius Rosenberg was a major Soviet spy. Why this avoidance of research on the core of the case by so many academics? I hope later in the evening we'll have an opportunity to discuss this.
Well, we will. And I'm just curious about one point. Let me throw it in now. If there were 50 academic studies and 50 PhDs were written about it, what large issues would come up that we don't know now?
I don't think any new issues would have come up, but I think what you would have is additional details and re-examinations of the original evidence. Ron's book is a wonderful comprehensive book of the case, but there's room for other scholars to redo what Ron has done, bring in new material that he didn't have access to in 1983, and to give us I think the main points would come out the same, but you would get a different perspective and a filling in of things which were not clear back in the 1980s.
Okay, what we know now about the Rosenbergs and the Rosenberg spy network, and Professor Radosh, start us off.
It seems that every year brings some new revelations about the Rosenberg case, thus reigniting a debate about the meaning of Julius and Ethel's actions, the extent of actually what they did for Moscow, and whether or not they harmed America's national security. The debate over their guilt, I think, is over. No one who respects evidence can believe that the Rosenbergs were innocent or that they only stole low-level industrial information that during World War II, the Soviets, as America's wartime allies, should have had anyway. The first dagger in the theory of innocence was material made public first in 1995 in the very first release of the Venona Project decrypts. These, of course, were the KGB cables from Moscow Center to their agents in the United States. 21 of the Venona File decrypts that have been translated concern the espionage activity of Julius Rosenberg in particular. What do they show? The files reveal, first, that Julius's code name was Liberal and Antenna. Then they later changed it to some other things. Among other findings, they show that the KGB regularly made use of both the American Communist Party as well as some of its front groups to get participants to engage in espionage, and they used the CPUSA as a recruiting tool from which to choose and develop new agents. They also showed that both Julius and Ethel recruited their sister-in-law, Ruth Greenglass, to work for the network. And later, she convinced her husband, David, to join it as well. We moved to 2008, when a man named Alexander Vasiliev released the complete series of his notebooks, files meticulously copied when he was working for the KGB and researching a book on its history at the KGB headquarters in Moscow. The Vasiliev files reveal that Julius Rosenberg had recruited yet another atomic spy, besides David Greenglass, an engineer named Russell McNutt, who worked at a firm building the atomic facility at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. They also reveal that Ethel Rosenberg was fully involved in recruiting people like her sister-in-law for espionage work, and that the information passed by David Greenglass, as the KGB said in a file, quote, mutually overlapped, unquote, with data sent to Moscow by major atomic spies, particularly Klaus Fuchs and Theodore Hall. The KGB described these messages as, quote, highly valuable, unquote. Next was our colleague Steve Usdin's book, Engineering Communism, in which Steve laid out in detail the espionage carried out by two members of the Rosenberg ring, Joel Barr and Alfred Sarant. Both had escaped the United States before the FBI had a chance to arrest them. They ended up, after stopovers in Czechoslovakia, in the Soviet Union, where Steve shows they used their expertise to develop the microelectronics industry and create Moscow's version of Silicon Valley. Most recently, Allen Hornblum wrote his book, The Invisible Harry Gold, in which not only does Allen make it clear that Gold was a spy for the Soviets, contrary to the assertions of Rosenberg's defenders, but he explains sympathetically why he decided to engage in espionage and reaches a conclusion that Gold told the truth and that Julius Rosenberg and his colleagues were not. Gold, however, was labeled by the Rosenberg's defenders as a delusional psychotic, while the Rosenbergs and Morton Sobel were portrayed as innocent martyrs to a McCarthyite witch hunt. Gold, readers learned from his book, was very intent on making amends for what he considered his traitorous acts and telling the truth, although his lawyers had ample legal ground that would have allowed Gold to escape indictment and prosecution. Perhaps the most recent damning news was the confession of co-defendant Morton Sobel to Sam Roberts of the New York Times in 2008 that he was indeed guilty. Sobel, however, at the time, claimed in that same interview with Roberts that he only gave the Soviets defensive weaponry that could not harm the United States. A few years later, Steve Usdin and I wrote an article for the Weekly Standard based on Steve's lengthy interview with Sobel. Sobel told us that, in fact, he gave the Soviets major military information. In 1948, as Joyce Milton and I speculated in our book, The Rosenberg File, reached a conclusion without the hard evidence, that Theodor von Karman, at the time the most prominent aeronautics engineer in the United States doing projects for the government and working at Columbia University, Greenglass told us that he took the files, had the files stolen by another member of the Rosenberg ring, a scientist named William Pearl, from his safe at Columbia University during a July 4th weekend, where they stayed up 24 hours photographing everything on a Leica camera, and then handing it the last day of the July 4th weekend to a KGB agent waiting for Sobel at a platform of the Long Island Railroad, from New York City to Long Island. That's about it for the new information, and other commentators, particularly Steve and Allen, will add more details to the nature of this new evidence.
Stephen Usdin will be speaking about the Rosenberg Network's key role in Soviet technological espionage. Steve, please.
Well, I do want to start, though, with a word about the motivation of the Rosenberg ring, because I think it's important. It's something that Harvey touched on. I got interested in the Rosenbergs because I met one of the members of the ring, Joel Barr, in Moscow. We became very, very good friends. He spent months at a time camped out on a sofa in my living room. And I got to know him, and I got to know Sobel a little bit. And the thing that strikes me about them that I think is quite important is that they weren't spying because they were trying to help an ally of the United States fighting fascism. They were spying because they were dedicated to communism and because they believed that the Soviet Union was building a utopian state, and they believed that the United States was a fascist state. They believed after the Second World War that military conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was inevitable, and they wanted to help the Soviet Union. That's the way that I see it, and I think that's a critical thing. So on to the non-nuclear technology, because there have been some allusions to the nuclear technology. Just a word about this. This is Julius Rosenberg's Communist Party registration card, and I don't know if you can see it, but the critical thing here is that it's from 1940. And anybody who was a member of the Communist Party in 1940, at a time when the Soviet Union was allied with Nazi Germany, that tells you something about his allegiance and his kind of dedication, I think. Anyway, moving on. Julius Rosenberg's primary value to the Soviet Union wasn't the information that he personally acquired. It was his talent at recruiting, managing, and motivating a number of spies and keeping them on track for years. It had 11, 12 spies that he recruited for the Soviet Union. This made the Rosenberg Ring an incredibly productive industrial espionage operation. Most of its members were engineers. They were working in defense plants, either working for the Army or working for defense contractors. Many of them were quality control engineers. Their jobs were to understand how advanced weapon systems were built and to be able to fix problems in the manufacturing of them. So they had to know how other kinds of similar technologies were built. Put them in a fantastic position to pass information to the Soviet Union. What's more, they were encouraged to bring their work home with them on the weekends. And of course, they had cameras that, Leica cameras, as Ron mentioned, that the Soviets had given them, so that put them in a position to copy a great deal of material. We know some of the information, exactly we know what they gave, either from Venona or from the memoirs of a Soviet case officer named Alexander Feklisov, or from the Vasilyev documents. On this slide, I've got some of the information that we know that the Soviets received from the Rosenberg Ring. The first one is the proximity fuse, which was, after the atomic bomb, probably the second most important and defended secret technology the United States developed during the war.
Why was that?
Excuse me?
Help us understand why that was.
The proximity fuse was a technology that allowed, that made it possible to shoot down airplanes, and then later it was used in other technologies. It had a radio transmitter in it that would send out signals, and then it would receive it back. And when a weapon got to be close to a target at a set range, then it would explode. It wasn't obvious, one, how to make this. The idea in itself wasn't obvious, and then the idea of how to make it wasn't obvious. The other reason that it was really critically secret was that if the enemy knew about it, it wouldn't be that difficult to have countermeasures. You could jam it, and things like that. So when the United States first deployed it, they were deployed it in the Pacific, where it would only be shooting down airplanes. So if any of the missiles didn't explode, they would fall in the sea and nobody would be able to use it. So Julius Rosenberg personally gave the Soviet Union blueprints for a proximity fuse. And not only that, but he gave them a working copy of it. He wrapped it up like a Christmas present in December of 1943 and gave that to the Soviet Union. Some of the other technology that the Rosenberg Ring gave that we know is the blueprints for the first American-designed jet engine, blueprints for the first American mass-produced jet aircraft, and the specifications and manufacturing instructions for the SCR-584 radar, which was one of the most important, if not the most important, radars that was produced in the Second World War. The Russians were so happy with the SCR-584 information that they offered to give the Rosenberg Ring a bonus of $1,000, and which was some money back then. And the members of the Rosenberg Ring were aghast that anybody would suggest that they were doing this for money, and they wouldn't take the money. But that gives you an idea of how important they thought it was. We also know that the Rosenberg Ring gave tens of thousands of pages of documents to the Soviets. We don't know exactly what was in them. We know that in 1945, Bill Pearl gave the 12,000-page blueprint for the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, plus another 5,000 pages. We also know that in 1945, Sobel gave 2,000 pages of documents to the Soviets. I think it's reasonable to infer that anything that they had access to, they gave. They weren't, that's what they were doing. So what I've done is to look and see, well, what did they have access to? What is it that they likely gave? And this gives, this slide has got some of the radar technology that they had access to. The summary of it is that basically every radar system that the United States produced during the Second World War, they had access to, and radar that was designed and produced after the Second World War that was first deployed in the Korean War. They had access to and they gave to I would say they gave to the Soviet Union. They also had access to early computer technology. And Bill Pearl worked for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics during the war. That was the predecessor to NASA. He had access to detailed information about advanced aircraft designs, jet engines, wind tunnel data, and much more. And Pearl's information was so valuable to the Soviets that they paid for a couple of communist agents to move to Cleveland. And his job, the man's job, was to copy the documents that Pearl produced. And his wife's job was to be a courier to take the information to New York. So that gives you an indication of the volume and importance of the information that they were providing. After the war, as Ron's mentioned, Pearl worked for Theodore von Karman, the most prominent aeronautics engineer in the United States, maybe in the world at that time. He was involved not only in advanced technology, but also in drafting and crafting American military doctrine. Over the July 4, 1948 holiday, as Ron mentioned, members of the Rosenberg Ring extracted the contents of Theodore von Karman's safe. They spent all night copying these documents, all 24 hours. And Morty Sobel told me that the film was so heavy, when there were so many canisters of 35 millimeter film, that he staggered under the weight carrying the box out to meet his Soviet contacts. I think it's important to remember that this was 1948. Spying for the Soviet Union in 1948 is quite a different matter, I think, than spying for the Soviet Union in 1944.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, just one more bit of the story, which is, I'll go over very quickly, which is Joel Barr and Alfred Sarant. Ron already mentioned them. There were two Americans. They escaped from the FBI in very dramatic fashion, ended up in the Soviet Union, helped to create the Soviet computer industry. This is a picture of them with Khrushchev in May 1961.
Mm-hmm. Can I say thank you now?
Yeah.
Thank you. Allen Hornblum, you're the expert on Harry Gold, so tell us about it.
Only 5 feet 6 inches in height with a moon face, funny walk, and submissive personality, Harry Gold was far from a prepossessing character. In fact, he was nearly invisible. You could easily pass him on the street a dozen times and never take notice. He was certainly no James Bond, at least not in the suave, physically imposing Sean Connery, Daniel Craig manner. But as everyone in this auditorium knows, Hollywood creations do not usually mesh with reality. Make no mistake, however, portly, mild-mannered Harry Gold was the real deal. He was a tireless, dedicated secret agent who earned his spurs, not to mention the Order of the Red Star, his Soviet medal. His impact on atomic espionage and the seemingly endless Rosenberg saga is nothing short of momentous. Not surprisingly, then, that J. Edgar Hoover would have called Gold a master Soviet spy, the target of the toughest case the FBI ever faced, and the centerpiece of the crime of the century. Even Miriam Moskowitz, someone he helped put in jail, said of Harry, "This little man set off an explosion that is still reverberating around the world." How this seemingly shy, well-intentioned connoisseur of baseball and Italian opera pulled off cloak and dagger, industrial and military capers for over a decade, including what is often described as the greatest scientific heist in history, is certainly intriguing and worthy of study, especially so as Gold underscores the importance of not overlooking the meek and the unassuming as capable of treacherous transgressions. But Gold is also historically important from a propaganda perspective. A human tripwire who eventually brought down numerous American spies working in behalf of the Soviet Union, he admitted his guilt, was given a 30-year sentence, and forever shunned by patriotic Americans. But the greatest animus he would face would come from progressives and communist sympathizers similar to Gold in worldview and philosophy, who viewed him as something akin to the Antichrist. As the informant who brought down the Rosenbergs and helped put them in the electric chair, he would become one of the most denounced, slandered, and demonized figures in 20th century America. For them, Gold was a pariah, a fiendish participant in as cruel a hoax as one could imagine. The castigation campaign commenced almost as soon as Gold confessed and began to name names. By the mid-50s, the verbal onslaught was in full swing. One critic, for example, described Gold as the product of a phenomenal imagination and pathological needs, an imposter and pseudologist of the first rank, a pathologic liar, a lonely creature in full manhood with a crying need for personal relationships, a self-admitted pathologic imposter whose only means of gratifying a lifetime of starved emotional needs was in the acting out of a spy career based on nothing more than his fantasy wish fulfillments. Naturally, one would assume such an incisive psychological portrait would come from a highly trained medical mind. But the author was actually John Wexley, a famous Hollywood screenwriter whose most noted works were Angels with Dirty Faces, The Last Mile, and Confessions of a Nazi Spy, films which helped make stars of Humphrey Bogart, Jimmy Cagney, and Edward G. Robinson. But Wexley was also a devout communist, and his mission was simple: prop up the myth of the Rosenbergs' innocence and destroy their accusers' credibility. His 1955 book, The Judgment of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, would stamp Gold as a deeply troubled mind. Many books would follow Wexley's lead. In fact, the cottage industry of politically slanted tracts attacking Gold and a government frame-up flooded the market. The best known of these, of course, is Walter and Miriam Schneer's Invitation to an Inquest. The New York Times called the book at its publication a major event in the history of the celebrated case. The book told of a governmental frame-up, FBI mendacity, and psychopathic personalities. Once again, Harry Gold is the centerpiece of a monstrous hoax. The Schneers relied on a slick cut-and-paste documentation and heaping dose of character assassination. Gold was repeatedly called abnormal, unsavory, and a strange human specimen. Nearly half a century after its publication, we now recognize the book as a great work of fiction, but a book that should be studied in political propaganda courses for its ability to deceive and trick millions of poorly informed readers over several decades. Even the Schneers themselves parted company with it when they revised their theories of the case with their last book in 2010. That slim volume, actually an elongated pamphlet with minimal documentation, was a last-ditch attempt to salvage their fading credibility as evidence continued to mount confirming Gold's account of the Rosenbergs' guilt. In conclusion, I would like to close on the unfortunate and sobering note regarding the public's capacity to buy well-packaged malarkey. One of the key lessons of the long-running Rosenberg saga may have been best expressed decades earlier by H.L. Mencken, who famously said about the success of similar canards, "No one ever lost money underestimating the intelligence of the American public." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allen. Mark Kramer, in the whole history of Soviet espionage, where would you place the Rosenberg case?
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Marvin. I'm going to be talking about the Soviet archives, what is accessible and where we get sources there. I have worked extensively in those archives over the last 22, 23 years. However, the KGB, there are three important archives dealing with espionage, really four archives. All of them are inaccessible. One would be because the KGB was both a state security apparatus, internal security, but also had its foreign intelligence directorate. They were together at the Lubyanka in an archive there until 1974, when the Foreign Intelligence Archive was moved out to a suburb of, on the outskirts of Moscow in Yasenova. However, there still are many foreign intelligence materials in the Lubyanka. It's not a very precise division between those two archives, between the KGB archive at the Lubyanka and the Foreign Intelligence Directorate in Yasenova. A third archive would be the GRU archive, the Military Intelligence Archive, which is hermetically sealed. No one that I know of has had access to it. And then a fourth archive would be the Presidential Archive, which has the Politburo records. And in there, you would find, for example, what was going to Stalin, how he judged it, and other important leaders, particularly Lavrentiy Beria, who was overseeing the Soviet Union from August 1945 until August 1949. He was overseeing the effort to build a Soviet nuclear weapon. He had been head of the secret police in earlier years and gained notoriety there. But his role in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War was to oversee the Soviet Union's bomb program. Everything coming in from espionage went to him. How do we know that, given that these archives are inaccessible? There are three collections outside the Soviet archives that are extremely important. One of these has, two of these have already been mentioned. The Venona documents, the decrypted Soviet foreign intelligence documents that were released in 1995 and 1996 by the CIA and the NSA here. Those were decrypted by analysts in what is now the National Security Agency. Second, the Alexander Vasilyev notebooks. It's hard to overstate again the importance of these because Vasilyev himself was a foreign intelligence officer in the KGB and then in the what became the separate foreign intelligence service during the Yeltsin period. And he was given privileged access in connection with the book he was producing. And the 11 notebooks he was able to smuggle out of the Russia eventually in the, after he himself moved to London, now are fully accessible online at the Cold War International History Project website, thanks to Alexander Vasilyev and John Haynes and Harvey Klehr. Another collection, which fortunately is now fully deposited at Cambridge University, the Churchill Archive Center, is the Vasily Mitrokhin collection. Mitrokhin was a KGB archivist in charge of the Foreign Intelligence Archive in the late 70s and early 80s. He transcribed and made notes from a lot of documents, and now his notes and other papers are accessible there. I went there in September. They were made available only in July. And I went there in September and photographed all the materials pertaining to, among other things, the United States. So they do add new information, even though I didn't see anything directly connected with the Rosenberg case there. There is a great deal of new information about the extent of Soviet espionage in the United States. Finally, one other source, and then I'll get to a couple of points I just want to raise about the role of the Rosenbergs in this espionage effort. There are many books that have been produced in Russia, memoirs in particular. These range from the extraordinarily unreliable and propagandistic to other memoirs that are actually very useful but have to be approached with great caution, as all memoirs do, but particularly when you're dealing with intelligence matters. There are also official collections that have been released by these inaccessible archives. And one of these collections in particular is of great value and directly relevant to the Rosenbergs, which is a 9 very large volumes of materials pertaining to the Soviet nuclear weapons program. And it's called Atomny Projekt SSR, or Atomic Project, Atomic Program of the USSR. And that contains some of the intelligence that was going to Beria into the chief Soviet nuclear scientist, Igor Kurchatov. It gives some sense, a very incomplete sense, but some sense of how they weighed this information that had been provided by the Rosenbergs and other spies in the Manhattan Project. So the 2 points that I just want to emphasize quickly in thinking about the Rosenbergs in light of the evidence that has emerged is we now have a much better sense of the extraordinarily aggressive Soviet espionage effort, not only in the United States, but around the globe during the Stalin period. This targeted some senior officials, but also often lower-ranking officials or even secretaries and janitors could be extremely valuable sources of information. And it was, what I would emphasize is Stalin, the purpose of this program was largely to gain secret information, much more so than having a direct influence on US policymaking. It's not to say that Stalin wouldn't have wanted that, but if you try to influence policymaking, then you risk being exposed if you're a spy. Whereas simply smuggling out secret information is something that a well-placed spy, even one who's only a janitor, can do and just be invaluable for both the Soviet intelligence apparatus and the Soviet nuclear weapons program. That's why the Manhattan Project was such a prime target of this in the United States, such a prime target of the Soviet espionage network. There are, particularly the military intelligence spies are still very poorly understood. We know a lot more now about the NKVD's network in the networks in the Manhattan Project, but even there it's incomplete. We do, however, know a great deal more about the Rosenbergs. The other point I just want to come to quickly, it has to do, Stalin himself during both the Great Purges against his party colleagues, and then in the subsequent Great Terror, when in the space of 16 months in the Soviet Union, about 820,000 people were shot by the NKVD, almost all of them non-communists. But the accusations that were often used in this were ones of spying against the Soviet Union, either American spies, British spies, Japanese spies. That was something, as archival sources about Stalin have emerged, it does seem, at least to some degree, he did believe there was an extensive espionage effort underway against the Soviet Union. Some of this was clearly manufactured and deliberate obfuscation, but to a large degree, he did genuinely believe it. And that makes it all the more ironic, I think, that after the Rosenbergs were convicted, to the time that they were executed in June 1953, that there was such an aggressive Soviet propaganda campaign to portray them as completely innocent and to suggest that they were simply victims of a smear. That the very thing that Stalin had continually emphasized as the basis for killing millions in the Soviet Union itself, he saw not Stalin, but Soviet officials portrayed that even the execution of two people, and I'm not trying to defend the execution, but just to say that the execution of those two were seen as unconscionable, and no one was questioning the millions who had died in the Soviet Union. So thank you.
Mark, it's true too, is it not, that the Rosenbergs were the only two spies throughout the entire Cold War executed in the U.S.?
In the United States, right?
In the U.S.?
Right.
Right. I'd like to make just a couple of points and then ask questions of you, and that will be for another several minutes or so. And then for the next half hour or so, I'd like very much to entertain your questions. And I note that there's a microphone over there and over there. So that's where the questions get asked. So if you want to ask a question, please go to the microphone. My observation to begin is that espionage is so common. It has happened since the beginning of relations among nations and among tribes. There are examples in the Bible. You can pick up examples in the Dreyfus case, for example, when the French government wanted to find out what Mrs. Dreyfus was doing, they put in a maid who was going to do it. Another person who was going to do the ironing was a spy for the French government. And so the idea that the Russians were doing this, they were just picking up what happens all the time. And my sense is that we are dealing with a subject that is common, and yet we address it in a most uncommon way, let me finish, as if it were unnatural, that people are spying on one another. They're always spying on us.
Well, no, the thing that people aren't always doing, and the thing that is unusual about the Rosenberg case, is that these weren't spies who were sent in, Russians who were sent to the United States,
I understand,
or
they're
Americans. These were people who were Americans who volunteered to spy for the Soviet Union because of their ideological, I would say religious
you made that
attachment
point,
to
Steve.
That's unusual. That's what makes it interesting.
No, but I don't think it is unusual, is my point. I think there have been people in societies from the beginning of time that have spied. It is simply what people do. It's the way nations behave.
What makes it
when
unusual?
you have friendly nations, just have one second. When we have friendly nations, not the Soviet Union against the U.S. or anything like friendly nations, we should have learned within the last 2 or 3 years, spy on one another. That is simply because they don't ultimately trust one another.
But they weren't as good as the Soviets. They were the New York Yankees, the 27 Yankees. Every nation had spies, but they were all in the minor leagues compared to what was sent here in the 30s and 40s. They developed a cadre of Americans, as Steve said, that I don't think you can find in any other nation.
Okay.
I think the other thing that really is unprecedented about Soviet espionage in the United States in the late 30s and 1940s is just how large it was. John and I estimated that somewhere north of 500 Americans were spying for the Soviet Union during World War II when we were allies, which is really quite remarkable. There was hardly any agency in Washington that was not infiltrated by a Soviet agent. There's a great story that when Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union, one of the things Winston Churchill ordered was that Britain cease its espionage efforts against the Soviet Union. He said, we're allies now. I want you to stop. And when the Soviets' British spies, Kim Philby and Donald McLean and Guy Burgess, were telling their Soviet handlers that the one thing that the Soviets wanted, who are the British spies in Moscow? Who's spying for the British? And Philby and those guys said, there aren't any. And for about 2 years, the Soviet Union seriously thought that Philby, Burgess, and McLean were triple agents. That is, they were working for the British because, Stalin's attitude was, of course I'm going to continue to spy. Why wouldn't the British? But in fact, Philby and those guys were right. The British had stopped it.
Marvin,
John.
at one point I might make about some of the emphasis of what we're saying here is there are a great many Americans who came to believe that the spy stories after World War II was the product of hysteria, that there actually were not Soviet spies. The Rosenbergs were innocent. Almost everybody accused they thought was innocent. This was all McCarthyist hysteria. Well, there certainly was some hysteria and extremism in that period. But the stories of Soviet espionage, in fact, were well-founded. And this belief that the Soviets did not spy during World War II is still believed by many people, I think.
And you also have to realize that these people lied about what they were doing. My favorite example is a newspaperman, most of you don't know his name, but he was well known then, Cedric Belfridge. who eventually started a pro-communist weekly newspaper called the National Guardian. He was eventually arrested and deported to his native Britain, and he wrote a book about the campaign against him, the McCarthyite campaign against him, in which he said, they accused me of a spy because of my progressive political views and my outspoken radicalism and defense of socialism around the world. It turns out, we know from all these documents, that he was indeed a paid KGB agent.
Do we have any idea, any view this question, do we have any idea how many American spies, that is Russians, were spying for the U.S. during World War II?
Very few.
Very few, if any.
Because just as Harvey said that Churchill called off the British espionage
Did we
effort,
call it off?
we called off what little we had. Keep in mind, we didn't have some 1930s, early 40s equivalent of the CIA. When the OSS was established in 1942, that was the first time we really had a robust intelligence program. And its policy from the beginning was that they would take in material and analyze things about the Soviet Union, but we would not use any covert means and covert agents. Mm-hmm. We would only do analytic work.
When did that start that we did begin to use them?
After World War II.
And do we know, for example, just arbitrarily in the 60s, when there were many Americans going into the Soviet Union, I remember that vividly, were they dealing with Russian spies working for the U.S.?
I mean, the nature of espionage for the Soviet Union at that point changed in that far more often by then the incentive would be monetary rather than ideological, some combination in some cases. But whereas during the Stalin period, it was almost entirely ideological loyalty.
You're talking about people who were spying for the Soviets
against
the United States, but what he was asking, what Marvin was asking about was American spying, American agents in the Soviet Union in the 60s.
Okay.
No, I was just kind of curious as to whether
that
existed. I would be shocked if we didn't have anybody.
Certainly, the FBI was interested in knowing what people encountered. Many people, though, didn't meet with FBI personnel. We do know of some that did, but it is a relatively small number.
It was the United States, for example.
It wasn't secret information they were turning over. They were just giving an impression of what daily life was like, how strict the restrictions were on them, and that sort of thing.
Now remember, when I was a correspondent in Moscow, there was an outfit called UPDK. And UPDK was the one responsible for providing a maid if you needed it, a driver if you needed it, that sort of assistance. About once a week, the maid came to me and asked, "Is there anything you can tell me that I can pass on?" Because it is required that I pass information on about what you're doing. And I felt very sorry for her. And I said, well, tell them that on Wednesday we had dinner with the British ambassador. Really? Oh. And that would be passed on, and that would be regarded too as information. And what I'm getting at here, I think, or I'm trying to, is what at this point about the Rosenberg case don't we know? Now, I appreciate that what we don't know, we don't know.
No,
but what is your sense of that?
Well, we don't know. Okay, we know that the Rosenbergs, getting back to the technology, we know that tens of thousands of pages of documents about American technology went to the Soviet Union. We know that the Soviets produced versions of much of the technology that the Rosenberg ring gave them. We know even that some of that was deployed in Korea during the war. We don't have a straight line that can say, this document went to the Soviet Union, and because of that, this weapon system was built. It's a leap of, you can think that it might be reasonable to suspect that, but you can't actually draw that line. That's the thing that we don't have, and we won't have unless we get access to
some of the files
that Mark was
talking about.
And I should add that just picking up on what Steve has said, we still don't have a good sense on what the filtering of information was. Even say in the case of Lavrenti Beria, the former secret police chief who was then in charge of the Soviet Union's effort to build a nuclear bomb. The materials that were published showing some of what went to him are extremely interesting because it's quite clear that Beria followed it very closely. But exactly what was sifted out from that is by no means clear. The role of the military intelligence, though, I would say is a gaping hole in what we know, because Venona was able to decrypt very little by way of military intelligence communications. It was almost all the foreign intelligence apparatus of the NKVD. And if the military intelligence files were to be opened, I suspect we would find that there were considerably more spies targeting military targets like the Manhattan Project.
I'd like to ask any of you who chooses to join me in this discussion sort of a cultural question / national. I just finished a book, I forgot the name of it, but the author is Ben McIntyre, an English journalist, and he's talking about the Philby case. Fact, the British spy group began to have suspicions about Philby in 1950, and for 2 years they conducted an investigation about Philby. When they talked to people who had also gone to Cambridge or Oxford, who had also belonged to the same clubs, who were also of the same faith, the line that they got was, Kim never would do anything like this. Please, let's not carry this on. It's embarrassing. Not until 1971 did they nail him, but the evidence was overwhelming. Now that is Britain. In the US, with the Rosenbergs and other spies, the atmosphere, the mood, would not have allowed that kind of easy approach to espionage. And Ron, I'm kind of curious, really, as to whether we're dealing with national differences here, or is it that the United States is a great power and we act differently from others? What is your feeling?
Well, the closest analogy to what you say, with all the protestations, Philby wouldn't do anything like that, is Alger Hiss. Because Alger Hiss, unlike the Rosenbergs, who were lower working class Jews living in the east side of New York in essentially public type housing without much money, their motivation was very different. But Alger Hiss was part of the establishment. He's Felix Frankfurter's law clerk. He was a prestigious law firm. He was in the State Department. Everybody, that's why Dean Acheson and others, Harry Truman,
so they would look to protect him.
They said they weren't trying to protect him. They couldn't conceive that someone like them would be or could be a spy. They found it just unfathomable. Couldn't be. So that is the same thing.
And you know, the other thing, too, is you should never underestimate the blundering of intelligence agencies. You know, Steve knows this better than anybody. I think it was Joel Barr. The FBI did a security check on him when he was working at...
So the story on that is that Joel Barr was fired from working for the Army on a radar project because the FBI found out that he was a communist. 6 weeks later, he got a job working in private industry with access to higher levels of classified information, and nobody, and it was widely known when he'd been at the place that he'd been fired because he was a communist. Julius Rosenberg was fired because he was a communist. A few weeks later, he was hired in private industry, again with access to higher levels of information. And Alfred Sarant was fired because he'd been organizing for a communist labor union. Again, a few weeks later, he got a job in private industry.
That sounds very much like Washington, D.C.
That did also, I should add, there were occasional things like that on the Soviet side as well, where spies in particular would be highly unreliable, often alcoholics, yet they would be kept on. And sometimes they still provided useful information, but sometimes it wasn't as useful. In other cases, though, the gaps were deliberate. For example, the Soviet Union had an extensive espionage network in Japan prior to the Second World War and into the early stages of the war. It could have provided that information to the United States, but none of that was provided. It's unfortunate because in some cases, given what is now accessible, including in the Mitrokhin files, it is quite clear that it would have been useful to the U.S. war.
Was that prior to Pearl Harbor?
That most of it was prior to that.
If we had known any of that, would that have?
No, as far as I can tell, the United States was unaware of the Soviet espionage network in Japan.
But it's also true that the Soviet Union was receiving material from some of its agents, Richard Sorja in Japan and others, that were telling them that Hitler was getting ready to attack. Yeah, and Stalin's response was, "No, that can't be true." So people can spy, and the people they're reporting to can filter it in different ways.
Richard Sorja gave the precise timetable of Operation Barbarossa and all the code words and everything, and he ended up being executed.
Okay, we'll go to the audience now, and I see one brave soul to my left. Please identify yourself, ask a question, don't make a speech, and let's go.
Bruce Guthrie. During the hysteria of the 50s, Joe McCarthy had basically a random number generator that was creating how many people, how many spies were in the government. And of course, we dismissed that as part of the hysteria. Is the attitude of the panel that Joe McCarthy's figures were actually low?
Interesting.
Well, I would say that McCarthy was right about the larger point. The United States government had been severely infiltrated by Soviet spies. He was wrong about most of the details. McCarthy, of the people McCarthy named, several of them we now know were Soviet spies, from Vasilyev and Venona and so on. But a number of the people he named were not. And the problem was McCarthy, his charges were scattershot. And John and I, in a book we wrote, compared it to sort of Gresham's law. You make enough stupid charges, and then people don't even believe the real ones.
On this side, name, please.
Jay Jupiter. I'm an ex-JAG officer. How would you compare the current mega leakers like Snowden and Assange, the WikiLeakers, to Gold and some of the other massive disclosures that were going on back then? Are they more dangerous, less, more valuable? How does it compare to the damage that was done back in the 50s?
Thank you very much. Who wants that one?
Well, I would say one of the huge differences, of course, is that it's a very different situation when somebody is providing espionage to the Soviet Union and that information is secret and it remains secret, and somebody who's leaking to the American public or to the public of the world. I think there's an enormous difference in the consequences of it and in the motivations for it.
Just a tag-on question. Are you upset with the Snowden revelations?
Personally?
You personally? Yeah.
No.
No, okay.
Let me just add quickly about the Snowden revelations. If Snowden's only concern were to reveal domestic surveillance and the like, which I think is a valid thing to be debated, but he also, much of what he released was highly valuable foreign intelligence programs that have nothing to do with domestic surveillance, and therefore I would say, it was very damaging, and I certainly don't share the admiration that quite a few people have for Snowden, even though, again, I think domestic surveillance is a perfectly valid issue for debate.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, sir.
My name is Mark as well. I have a question about a documentary, I believe that was done in the late 70s, early 80s about the Rosenberg case, starting with a press person who saw the execution and talking about what happened to both of them through that execution. What is anybody's opinion of the situation in regards to whether this is documented, it's obviously sympathetic for them.
Is that the unquiet death of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg?
I think so. There's several people that are interviewed that later on come out and say that...
That was very similar to Wexley's book and the Schneer book. It was really a piece of left-wing propaganda where the Rosenbergs were absolutely innocent and Gold was this, psychotic figure.
So my question to that situation is, for an espionage case for capital punishment in this country, and the only case of such where people were put to death for that, they to their death said they were innocent. Why not just say, yes, I'm guilty, and suffer the consequences for that fact? Any opinions on that?
We just discussed this over dinner, actually, and I think there's uniformity of belief that if they would have admitted their guilt, they would have possibly still been alive, maybe even been on the street. Certainly, I believe Ethel would have been out in 5, 10, 15 years. But they were prepared and ready to die for a cause. The Soviet Union and communism was the most important thing in their life. And they argue, or the Mirapol boys, the sons argue today, that the parents, now they finally state, were involved in espionage. For decades, they attacked Ron and some others for saying they were guilty when they actually weren't. But of course, we know they were. But the sons and defenders argue they didn't want to give up names. They didn't want to turn on their brethren, the people they recruited to do the espionage work. Well, I've spent a lot of years in various aspects of law enforcement, and I see criminals all the time under serious charges. And finally, when the pressure is put on, they admit their guilt, but they don't give up names. They just hope for a more lenient sentence. And there's no doubt in any of our minds that they would have been spared. They would not have been executed. They just had to admit their guilt. But they wanted to become martyrs, and they did, and they wanted to serve the Soviet Union, and they did. And that's why they received their medals, and to this day, there is still debate and argumentation taking place.
I want to add to that I think both the Communist Party and the fellow traveling groups that ran the Rosenberg Defense Committee, two things about that. One is that they wanted them to die because it was of great use. As we argued in the Rosenberg File, the trial, the appeal, and that whole propaganda campaign until the execution coincided with the Slansky purge trials in Czechoslovakia. And the same people who waged the Rosenberg defense used the argument in Czechoslovakia, innocent people are being killed because they're Jewish. In the United States, guilty people are being killed, and they were, of course, all Jewish. In the United States, Jews were being killed because they were progressive and they were Jewish. In other words, they brought in the idea that it was also anti-Semitic. And late in the campaign, you remember that there was a Nashville, Tennessee maverick liberal lawyer named Fike Farmer, who on his own entered an appeal to the Supreme Court based not on the defense of the Rosenberg team, but in the article that the Rosenbergs were tried by the government under the wrong law. And if they had been tried not in the Espionage Act, but on the Atomic Energy Act, then there could have been no death sentence. So he appeared to argue his case before the Supreme Court. And so were the Rosenberg lawyers, led by Emanuel Bloch, at that court hearing. And they both testified. And Emanuel Bloch, the Rosenberg's lawyer, got up to argue against the amicus curiae brief filed by Fike Farmer, so vigorously, arguing against it, when Farmer's whole point is that if I'm right, this would save their lives. One of the Supreme Court justices turned to Fike Farmer, to Emanuel Bloch, and said, Mr. Bloch, you seem to be arguing for the government's case now. The party wanted them dead. And the second point I wanted to make, that alluded to one of the last points Mark made that I forgot to make, the entire propaganda campaign, I found from close reading the Vasiliev notebooks, was led and created by the KGB, which actually gave instructions to the communists in the United States how to wage a propaganda campaign. I wrote it up in World Affairs Journal, and it's online. You can look it up for the details. But
Let me add to that also, Ron, is with some of the documents in both the department that was known as the Propaganda Department in the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party, and also in the Department for Foreign Relations, show that there were officials in those departments in charge of the propaganda campaign vis-a-vis the Rosenbergs. They actually, at least some of them, I can't say it was true of all, but some of them were hoping that the Rosenbergs would be put to death because they saw it as creating martyrs that they could then exploit. And they also saw it as a way of silencing the Rosenbergs before they disclosed more about, or disclosed anything about the extent of Soviet espionage in the United States.
We've got 15 minutes left. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Vince. You use the term Rosenbergs, plural, and the pronoun they. The evidence against Ethel, to be very mild, is far more ambiguous than the evidence against Julius. Anybody up there have misgivings about Ethel's role if she truly was a spy? She's got no code name and Venona, et cetera. I'm wondering if anybody feels that we should separate Julius and Ethel and look at them in different ways.
Thank you.
All right,
John?
let me comment on that. I don't think there's anything the slightest bit ambiguous about the evidence about Ethel's active participation in Soviet espionage. She was not, however, a major spy the way her husband was. She acted as his assistant. So he was the primary, she was the secondary. But she was not the little woman back in the kitchen. She was actively involved, both in the decrypted Venona cables and in Vasilyev's notebooks. There are references by KGB officers who cite Ethel as being a source of recommendation of recruits. And they trusted her, they thought her judgment was good, and so they sent cables to Moscow saying Julius is suggesting recruiting X, Y, and Z, and Ethel's opinion is the same. And in Vasilyev's notebooks, in a report written by Julius himself on the recruitment of Ruth Greenglass, he makes it very clear that he does not think he could have recruited Ruth without Ethel's help, because Ethel reassured Ruth that her husband, Ethel's brother, would want to join this network once it was made clear to him what they were involved with. You see, Greenglass was in Los Alamos. Julius couldn't get there to recruit him. Ruth, as his wife, could go. So recruiting Ruth was key to recruiting David, and Ethel was key to recruiting Ruth.
Thank you very much, John.
I think it's clear that the government's decision to indict Ethel and then the death penalty was an effort to pressure Julius. You know, and I don't know how other people feel. You know, I think even the FBI agents that worked on the case were shocked by Ethel's death sentence. Bob Lamphere, who worked extensively on the case, said that he wrote the letter that was sent under J. Edgar Hoover's signature asking that Ethel not be put to death. And interestingly, the reason that Hoover gave in that letter was that Ethel was the mother of small children.
Interesting. Yes, please.
Yes, Jeffrey Earl from the History Department at the University of Maryland. First, I'd like to underscore the point that Harvey made at the outset, namely the neglect of the anti-Semitic purges in the Soviet Union, which in the last 40 years has occupied a far smaller a place in American political discussion and imagination than the Rosenberg case did. But I have two questions.
Try one first.
Okay. They're very, very short questions. At the time, and since, there are people who said that the nuclear secrets that the Rosenbergs gave to the Soviets were elementary drawings of no great significance. Is that the case? And the second question concerns the response to the Rosenberg File. And as a historian, it seems to me that the response to your work is one of the less impressive moments in the history of the American historical profession. And namely, I think there was a lot of denial of fact and evidence, which is what we're supposed to be about.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Who wants to pick that up? Ron?
What was the first part of it again?
How valuable
value
is
of
the
the-
atomic?
The sketches, Philip Morrison, the late scientist who worked there and actually had the patent for the bomb in his name. He was in a different realm of physics than research in physics than Hall and Fuchs, but he was at Los Alamos, and he said to me, notice when I signed a brief that the Rosenberg's life should be spared, I was very careful not to say they were innocent. I avoided that entirely because he said I always thought they were guilty, and moreover, as a scientist, I knew immediately, as limited as that sketch was, the Russians could immediately see the information they were getting from other people about the process of implosion, that this confirmed it, that they were not being misled with disinformation by intelligence agents. So he said, in fact, this little sketch, which the defense said was a joke, he didn't have a college degree, he was just a mechanic, he was just hired there not as an engineer, he was on a production plant. He said, that may all be true, but nevertheless, what he sketched was clearly enough for any scientist to know what it meant, and it was valuable. And that's the point.
Let me add something else. Even though at the time Greenglass only admitted to the sketches, we now know from the Vasiliev notebooks, he also actually turned over to the Soviets an actual model of part of the implosion trigger mechanism, a real item, not just a sketch. He didn't admit that at the time because I think that would have really damned him in the eyes of the government. I mean, he got a bad enough sentence as it was. He actually said, I turned over part of the trigger mechanism. That would really look bad.
Just a quick addition on, with regard to the Soviet Union, the volumes I mentioned that have documents about the early Soviet nuclear weapons program do show that these sorts of sketches and all the other information was provided. They were analyzed and weighed by Soviet scientists, especially Kurchatov, and also by Beria himself. So even things that were seemingly not that important were ways of trying to confirm what was there and of also trying to sift out what wasn't reliable, which was equally important. One other quick thing would be what Jeff Hurth mentioned about the anti-Semitic campaign in the Soviet Union during the final years of Stalin's life, basically from around 1948 on, was extraordinarily ugly. It's hard to overstate how repugnant some of the comments being made in the Soviet Union were, both in public and in private. Stalin had not, certainly in his early years, manifested any sign of anti-Semitism, but in the final years of his life, he took this vicious anti-Semitic turn. Fortunately, it came to an end when he died. So by the time the Rosenbergs were put to death in June of 1953, that wave of anti-Semitic hysteria in the Soviet Union had abated.
Thank you, Mark. Last question, please.
Okay. My name's Spiridon, and Judge Kaufman, one of his biggest charges against the Rosenbergs was that by providing the Soviet Union, providing the bomb to the Soviet Union, it gave him the courage or the fortitude to start the Korean War. Now, it makes perfect logical sense, but is that actually proven by any documents found in the Soviet archives? I guess this is for Dr. Kramer.
Yeah, I mean, the timing, again, David Holloway in his book on the building of the Soviet nuclear bomb had estimated that the extent to which the Soviet Union's own nuclear weapon was accelerated by espionage was probably, but he estimated, gave a range from 6 months to 2 years. That range, I would say, is borne out quite well by what has emerged. Holloway, at the time he wrote that book, it came out in 1994, had no access to any of the information I mentioned in Venona or in the Vasiliev notebooks or in Mitrokhin or in the volumes that were published. is I look at that information. I would say it was probably between a year and 18 months. So it would include the period with the start of the Korean War in June 1950. But whether that was, again, from what is available now, there were important factors, but I would give greater, it did play a role, so it is brought up, but I would give greater weight to the lack of a U.S. response to the revolution in China that brought communists to power, and also what is now clear, Dean Acheson's speech in January 1950 played a role as well in suggesting that the United States would not respond in Korea. And Stalin definitely, as is evident from the archives, believed that. And he was stunned when Harry Truman did send troops to defend South Korea.
Let me follow up on that just very quickly. There is, Kim Il-sung of North Korea had been requesting Soviet support for an invasion of the South for some time, and Stalin had been turning him down. He finally decided to support the invasion. And there is a Stalin memo where he cites some of the things that have changed his mind. A prominent one was Mao Zedong's success in China, but he also cites the Soviet Union's success in setting off a nuclear weapon, his implication being that neutralizes the American possibility of using nuclear weapons in response. Mm-hmm. So Stalin does himself cite that as one of the factors in his decisions.
What I would like to do now before we wrap it up completely, as if we're doing a television program in the old days, I want to ask you for a final thought. And I don't want each of you to go beyond a minute, but a final thought, and I'll start with Mark and go right down the line here.
Okay, in looking at, again, at the materials that have emerged over the last 23 years or so in Russia and outside Russia, the thing that strikes me most, again, is simply the scale and aggressiveness of the Soviet espionage effort during the Stalin era. And again, we've been focusing on the networks in the United States, but it was true all around the world. At least I've been tabulating how many countries, and at least 40 countries that I can see, there were quite extensive Soviet spy networks. And it's in that context that the Manhattan Project spy network was especially important. But there was this vast inflow of information from around the world.
Allen?
I'd like to compliment you folks for coming out on a cold night. You could be home in your living room watching reruns of Laverne and Shirley or some basketball, what have you. So I think we all applaud you coming out tonight. And the only thing that I would bring up, and I'm sorry that we didn't get into it because I think it is important, it does irritate me, is the ability of a small but dedicated crew of people, in this case the Mirapols and Moskowitz and Schneers and others, who continue to trot out this canard. And they are tremendous at dedicated and convincing people that there's some truth to what they're arguing, even though there was so much evidence out there that shows that in this specific case, the Rosenbergs were involved, they were guilty, Harry Gold was telling the truth. But, you know, there's a popular movie out now, The Imitation Game. Some of you have seen it. Yeah. Well, they've been running a confidence game, you know, this force out there for decades, 2 generations at least. And it really has hurt the fabric of American philosophy, that it pitched battles between various forces that we really don't need. There's enough problems in the country. You don't have to make things up to start a philosophical war over.
Steve.
So I think that the thing, I guess, that I started with that fascinates me is the idea that you can that a very small group of ideologically motivated people who grew up in this country committed crimes for a foreign and a false ideology, and that they were able to get away with it for so long is a fascinating and important thing, and you know, and you could argue that it has some relevance for things that are happening in other parts of the world today.
Ron?
Yes, I pick up on what Allen said and also what Jeffrey Herf alluded to in his comments from the floor. Much of the American Academy today is where the strength of what I call the hard left is in America. They are particularly in the profession of history. And he mentioned one of the reasons I was so attacked, including by a well-known prominent historian who spoke on this stage two nights ago, said that the Rosenberg case was not about espionage, it was about suppressing the progressive movement of the time and the American Communist Party. It was all a witch hunt. And there was a whole campaign against me personally at the time of the book for violating every tenet of history, for daring to say they were guilty, and so forth. And the reason they do that today, what distinguishes the left today in this contemporary period is hatred of America. America is always the single force for evil in the world. And secondly, the hatred of Israel, because it's America's ally and America gives it money for its defenses. If you hate America, it comes down to if you say America was right during the Cold War in some of these cases, you are defending America and not making it the enemy. In order to maintain the ideological stance, people like the Rosenbergs, despite all the evidence, have to be essentially innocent. If not innocent, morally innocent.
One of the things that fascinates me is sort of the psychology of the reaction to the Rosenberg case. You know, as several people mentioned, Morton Sobel finally confessed to committing espionage. After 50 years of denying it, he wrote a big book in which he would give speeches in which he would talk about how he was innocent, how the Julius and Ethel were martyrs, that they were innocent. If you suggested that the Rosenbergs could have saved their lives and avoided making their children orphans, merely by admitting the truth, the response was, well, they couldn't do that because that would be lying. They couldn't lie. Well, we now know if they told the truth, they probably would not have been executed. And so the whole psychology of that is, to me, quite fascinating. And somebody comment about psychoanalyzing somebody without a medical degree, but it strikes me that one of the saddest aspects of it is the Mirapol children, who have to live with the fact that their parents were more committed to Joseph Stalin and communism than they were to their own children.
John?
Let me just follow up briefly on what Ron said about the vehemence of the attacks on him. Those attacks were so vehement in the academy that is why the historians and researchers who have written scholarly level books on this case are sitting right here. This is where that's all there is. Because so many young historians realized that going into this area was a career killer. If you started writing about the substance of the Rosenberg case, your chances of getting a job at a decent school or getting tenure were markedly reduced.
Why? Why?
Because in the academy there are a sufficient number of hard left historians who would be in a position, sitting on hiring committees, to veto someone who wrote in this area. They're not in a position to hire their own, but in modern American political history, there are hundreds of applicants for every position. Vetoing people, blackballing them is easy. So that I think is why the scholarly study of this case is a lot thinner than it really ought to be, because the academy, particularly younger historians, have been intimidated.
Well, I think that we have heard some fascinating, I think controversial issues now about American education, about the role of a small group in terms of influencing policy, perhaps. And in my mind, and I'll stop right after this, Eric Holder, our Attorney General still, believes that the single largest problem that he has is homegrown Muslim terrorists. And how you manage that problem, since they're all Americans, but they appear to have an allegiance, a desire, whatever it be, to move in an anti-American direction. So we live, you know, with every today as many yesterdays, and I think that we are picking up continuously a stream of important information that has to be absorbed and somehow or another woven into our common psyche. I think you guys have been absolutely wonderful tonight, but you have all been even more wonderful for coming. Thank you all very much. Thank you.